I needed a camera for a college course, and since I was on a tight budget, I turned to Craigslist to find something affordable. After a few days of searching, I found a listing that seemed perfect, a semi-professional camera at an incredibly low price. The seller was a man named Mark, who suggested we meet at a local park to make the transaction. I found it a bit strange that he didn't want to do the sale at his house or in a more common public place, but the offer was too good to pass up. On the day of the meeting, I arrived at the park a few minutes before the scheduled time. The place was quiet, with a few people strolling and children playing in the distance. When I saw Mark, he was sitting on a bench with the camera beside him, looking nervous. He was a middle-aged man with deep dark circles and an alert look, as if he were expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. As I approached, Mark abruptly stood up, holding the camera with trembling hands. He seemed anxious to complete the transaction as quickly as possible, which made me suspicious, but he insisted that I test the camera right there. Reluctantly, I agreed. I took some photos of the park, capturing the trees, the empty benches, and the playground in the background. Everything seemed to work perfectly. Mark watched me closely as I took the photos, as if waiting for something specific. His eyes followed my every move, and the way he leaned slightly forward, almost impatient, made me uncomfortable. I tried to speed up the process, convinced that something was wrong, but the camera worked perfectly, and I didn't want to miss a good opportunity. I completed the purchase, handing Mark the money, which he almost snatched from my hand before quickly walking away, muttering a "good luck," without even looking back. I stood there for a moment, trying to process his strange behavior. Something about the situation didn't feel right, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Maybe he was just going through a tough time, I thought, trying to rationalize the incident. With the camera in hand, I left the park, trying to ignore the feeling that there was more to this sale. When I got home, I began to examine the camera more closely. That's when I noticed a detail that Mark had forgotten. There was a memory card in the camera. Curious, I decided to see what was on it, not knowing that I was about to discover something that would change my life forever. As soon as I realized there was a memory card in the camera, my curiosity grew. There was something almost irresistible about the idea of discovering what Mark had forgotten, or perhaps left on purpose. I sat at the kitchen table and turned on the camera, navigating to the stored photos on the card. What I saw made me freeze inside. The first photos seemed normal at first glance, images of the park where we met, but something about them was disturbingly out of place. Each photo showed a different person, always alone, in some isolated corner of the park. However, there was something strange about their expressions, which seemed vague, empty, as if they were unconscious or in some state of shock. Some of the people were lying on the ground, in positions that suggested they were not just sleeping or resting. I kept scrolling through the images, and my discomfort grew with each photo. In one of the photos, a man was lying on his back on a bench, his head hanging to one side, his eyes half open and lifeless. In another, a woman was sitting on the grass, but with her head tilted forward in a strange way, as if her neck were broken. There was no sign of explicit violence, but the feeling that something terrible had happened to these people was undeniable. The worst part was when I began to recognize some of the people in the photos. There was a woman I was sure I had seen on the news a few days earlier, listed as missing, and the man on the bench, he looked a lot like a professor who, according to colleagues, had recently gone missing. A sense of panic began to overtake me, as I realized that the photos were not just disturbing, they could be evidence of something much more sinister. My first instinct was to delete the photos and pretend I had never seen them, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't just ignore what I had discovered. These people were missing, and now I had evidence that could help find out what had happened to them. But why would Mark have left the memory card in the camera? Did he really forget? Or was it on purpose? And if it was on purpose, what would be the reason? Did he know I would find it? Or was he trying to rid himself of some responsibility, passing the burden to someone else? With my mind full of questions, I decided I had to do something. Going to the police seemed like the best option. But part of me was terrified at the thought of getting involved in something that was clearly beyond what I could handle. What if Mark was watching? What if he knew I had seen the photos? Every thought only increased my fear. but I knew I couldn't just stand still. So I made a decision. The next day, I would return to the park and try to find Mark. I needed to confront him, find out what he knew, and understand what was really going on. Those photos wouldn't leave my head, and the feeling that something terrible was lurking haunted me. I had no idea what I would find, but I knew I couldn't ignore what I had discovered. My life was already changing, and there was no turning back. The next day, I woke up with my mind still heavy with the images I had seen the night before. Each of the photos seemed etched into my memory, and the feeling that something sinister was about to happen only grew. Even so, I prepared to return to the park, determined to confront Mark. I needed answers. I needed to understand what those photos meant and how he was involved. I posted an ad on Craigslist looking for a tenant for the extra room in my house. I had been living alone for years, and besides wanting help with the bills, I thought some company might break the loneliness. I received a few responses, but one candidate in particular stood out: Greg. He was polite, seemed calm, and during our brief phone conversation, I felt that he would be a good choice. We arranged a visit, and soon after, he moved in. At first, everything seemed normal. Greg was reserved, but friendly enough. We spent most of our time in our own spaces, and he didn't seem to have many visitors or cause any trouble. I was relieved to have found someone so easy to live with. However, a few weeks after Greg moved in, I started noticing strange things. One night, while I was lying in bed, I heard a sound that made me sit up immediately. It was a muffled sound, like something heavy being dragged above me in the attic. I remembered that I had locked the attic before Greg moved in, and that, as far as I knew, no one had been there since. I tried to ignore the sound, convincing myself that it could just be the wind or an animal, but the sound was distinct and persistent. And more importantly, it seemed to be happening late at night, when Greg should already be asleep. The next day, I mentioned the noise to Greg. He gave me a relaxed look and suggested it could be some animal that found a way in. "These old houses, you know, always full of surprises," he said with a smile. But there was something in the way he avoided eye contact that made me suspicious. I decided to let it go, thinking I might be paranoid. But the noises continued, and besides that, I started noticing other things that made me uneasy. Sometimes, it seemed like my belongings had been moved, although nothing was really out of place. A pen that I was sure I had left in one corner of the desk would appear in another, or a book was closer to the edge of the shelf than I remembered. They were subtle changes, but enough to make me uncomfortable. What bothered me the most was Greg's behavior. He seemed to always be home, but I rarely saw him. There were times when I passed by the hallway and heard whispers coming from his room, as if he were talking to someone. However, when I stopped to listen more closely, the sound disappeared. I began to wonder if there was something more to Greg that I didn't know, something he was hiding. My suspicion grew, but I didn't know how to address the issue without seeming invasive or overly distrustful. However, I knew I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was very wrong. I decided that I needed to find out what was going on, but to do so, I would have to take a step that would change everything. My distrust of Greg only grew, and the sounds coming from the attic became more frequent. I couldn't ignore the feeling that he was involved in something much more sinister than it seemed at first glance. I decided that the only way to discover the truth was to investigate on my own. I put a plan into action to find out what Greg was doing in the attic, if he was indeed there. I bought a small security camera, the kind that can be easily hidden. I discreetly installed it in a corner of the hallway, directed towards the attic door. I planned to leave it recording overnight, hoping to capture some suspicious activity. I was nervous, but curiosity and the need for answers were stronger. That night, I pretended to go to sleep as usual, but I stayed awake, anxious to see what the camera would capture. The hours passed slowly, and my mind was on high alert, paying attention to any sound or movement. Finally, around 2 a.m, I heard the stairs creak. I went to the screen of my laptop, where the camera's video was being streamed in real time. What I saw made my heart race. Greg was standing in the hallway, looking towards the attic door. He looked different, more tense, as if he were in some kind of trance. Slowly, he approached the door and opened it, revealing the dark abyss of the attic. He looked around, as if making sure no one was watching, and then climbed the stairs, disappearing into the darkness. My stomach churned at the sight. He was indeed going to the attic, but for what? I waited a few minutes, mentally preparing myself for what was to come. I needed to know what Greg was doing up there. I grabbed my phone, put it on silent mode, and started recording video. With light steps, I headed towards the attic door and climbed the stairs, trying not to make any noise. When I reached the top, my heart almost stopped. Greg was standing in the middle of the attic, surrounded by strange symbols drawn on the floor with chalk. There were candles arranged in a circle around him, and the faint light from the flames cast shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. He was muttering something in a language I didn't understand, his hands raised above his head. It looked like he was in some sort of ritual, and the intensity in his eyes was frightening. There was no doubt, Greg was performing some kind of occult practice. I stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching in shock as Greg continued his ritual. The atmosphere in the attic was suffocating, filled with a heavy energy that made me feel as if the air was being sucked out of my lungs. Every fiber of my being wanted to run, to get out of that house, but something forced me to stay, as if I needed to witness what was happening. Then, something happened that I could never have predicted. The air around Greg began to vibrate, and the shadows from the candles seemed to take on a life of their own, moving unnaturally. The words he was muttering grew louder and more frantic, and a sense of pure terror overwhelmed me. Before I could process what was happening, the shadows began to gather around him, forming an indistinct but incredibly threatening figure. Panic took hold of me. I knew I couldn't stay there another second. With the camera still recording, I descended the stairs as quietly as I could, my heart pounding uncontrollably. Once in my room, I locked the door and tried to calm my breathing. I knew I had witnessed something dangerous, something that put my life at risk. The next morning, after a nearly sleepless night, I knew I had to act. What I had seen in the attic was something I couldn't ignore. Greg wasn't just an eccentric tenant. He was involved in something truly dark, and whatever he was invoking or trying to control didn't seem human. I felt my life was in danger, and I needed to get out of that house as quickly as possible, but not without confronting Greg and understanding exactly what was going on. I descended the stairs with a heavy heart, but determined. The house was strangely silent, as if even the walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Greg was in the kitchen, acting as if nothing had happened, calmly making coffee as usual. The idea of confronting him gave me chills, but I couldn't avoid it any longer. "Greg, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me, surprised, but soon his eyes narrowed, as if he knew something had changed. "About what?" he responded, his voice neutral, but there was a palpable tension in the air. "About the attic. About what you were doing up there last night," I said, trying to hold the phone in my pocket, where the recording of the ritual was still saved. Greg's reaction was immediate. His expression changed from surprise to something darker, almost threatening. He took a step towards me, which made me involuntarily back away. "You were spying on me?" he asked, his voice low but laden with a veiled threat. My instinct told me to run, but something made me stay. "What are you doing here, Greg? Who or what are you invoking in the attic? You didn't tell me the truth when you moved in here, and now I need to know what's really going on." Greg was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on mine. I could see the internal struggle happening inside him, as if he were deciding what to do next. Finally, he sighed, looking almost resigned. "You don't understand what's happening here, and it's better that you don't. There are things that are better left alone." "No, Greg," I retorted, trying to keep my voice firm. "You're putting me in danger. If you don't tell me the truth, I'll go straight to the police." It was then that the front door was broken down, and police officers stormed into the house, weapons drawn, shouting for us to stay where we were. The scene unfolded quickly. Greg was handcuffed before he could react, and I was pushed aside, confused and in shock. As the police led him away, one of the investigators approached me, with an expression that mixed concern and relief. "Are you okay?" he asked. We received an anonymous tip about suspicious activities in this house. We've been investigating Greg for some time, but we couldn't locate him until now. I could barely respond, still stunned by what was happening. What? What did he do? I managed to ask, my voice weak. The investigator explained that Greg was wanted in another town for involvement in dangerous occult activities. There were suspicions that he was trying to perform rituals that could cause harm not only to himself, but also to others around him. The details were scarce, but it seemed I had unwittingly gotten involved in something much larger and more dangerous than I could have imagined. After Greg was taken away, the police inspected the attic. When I went up to see what they found, the attic looked completely different. The symbols drawn on the floor and the candles had disappeared, as if they had never been there. It seemed as if the attic itself had been cleaned, leaving only emptiness and silence. I stood there for a moment, trying to process everything. Greg had disappeared from my life as suddenly as he had entered, but the sense of danger was still there, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. And in the days that followed, I tried to return to normalcy, but I could never feel safe in that house again. Finally, I decided to move out, leaving behind anything that could remind me of Greg and what he had brought into my life. But even now, far from that house, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear the sound of footsteps in the attic. I needed a new car, but with a tight budget, I was turning to Craigslist in search of something affordable. That's when I found a listing that seemed too good to be true. A car in excellent condition, at a price well below market value. It was a model I had always liked, a classic, solid, and reliable. The ad seemed legitimate, and the seller, a woman named Anne, explained that she was selling the car because it belonged to her late husband, and she needed to get rid of the painful memories. I arranged to meet Anne at her house to see the car. When I arrived, I was greeted by a middle-aged woman with a sad but friendly demeanor. The car was in the garage, and it looked as good as it did in the ad photos. The paint was flawless, the interior well-maintained. It was hard to believe it was being sold at such a low price. Anne, with a soft and melancholy voice, talked about how much the car had meant to her husband, how careful he had been with the vehicle, and how hard it was for her to part with it. During the conversation, I casually asked about the car's history, and Anne, after a pause, mentioned that her husband had died in a car accident, though not in the car I was about to buy. She said the vehicle was in perfect condition, and that the accident had happened on another road, far from there. There was something in her voice that suggested deep pain, but also an urgency to get rid of the car. Maybe she needed the money, or perhaps she just wanted to erase the memories. After a brief negotiation, I agreed to buy the car. As we finalized the details, Anne seemed relieved, but there was something in her eyes that made me uncomfortable, as if she were shedding a burden. I tried to dismiss the feeling, convinced that I had made a great deal. I drove the car home, enjoying the smoothness of the engine and the sense of having made a good purchase. In the first few days, everything seemed normal. The car ran well, with no mechanical issues. I was pleased with the purchase, until strange things started happening. First, it was the radio that changed stations on its own, always tuning to a frequency I didn't recognize, playing an old, melancholic song that made me uneasy. Then, the car began to inexplicably stall on a specific road, forcing me to stop and try to restart the engine several times before I could continue. The discomfort began to grow within me, but I still tried to ignore it, believing it was just a coincidence. It was when I started investigating the car's history that things really began to get scary. What I discovered made me question everything and realized that there was more to buying the car than I could have imagined. At first, I tried to ignore the strange things happening with the car. I checked the radio myself, trying to find some defect that would explain why it changed stations on its own, but found nothing wrong. The phenomenon continued, and each time the old, melancholic song began to play, a chill ran down my spine. But the worst of all was the car's behavior on a specific road that I needed to travel daily to get to work. Every time I drove on that road, the car started to fail. The engine would choke, and the car would end up stalling, forcing me to stop on the shoulder. The first few times I managed to restart the car after a few minutes, But the situation worsened. It got to the point where I feared driving on that road, always wondering if the car would let me down again. Each time the car stalled, the feeling that something was wrong grew inside me. I decided I needed to understand the car's history better. Although Anne had mentioned her husband's accident, she had been vague about the details. I was determined to find out more. I began my investigation by searching for accident records in the area where Anne mentioned. And that's when I found the first disturbing clue. Anne's husband had died in an accident on that very road where my car always stalled. I kept researching, and with each new detail I uncovered, the story became darker. Anne's husband was not alone in the car during the accident. His wife was with him, and both died at the scene. The police report indicated that the accident had been caused by an unexplained brake failure, which, curiously, was in the same model of the car I had bought. Anne was not selling the car that belonged to her husband. She was selling the very car in which they both died. The revelation shook me deeply. I was driving a car that had been involved in a fatal accident, and worse, the same car seemed to be tied to that specific road where the accident occurred. It was as if the car was trying to tell me something, or worse, trying to make me repeat the same tragic fate that the previous owners had faced. The more I thought about it, the more terrified I became. The car's failures, the radio playing that disturbing song, everything seemed to be connected to the accident. I started having nightmares about the car, waking up in a cold sweat, feeling as if something was watching me. I could no longer ignore the fact that something was very wrong with that vehicle. I decided I could no longer keep that car. It was affecting me in ways I could never have predicted, and I feared something terrible might happen if I continued driving it. I made the decision to return the car to Anne, hoping she could give me more explanations, or at the very least, help me get rid of it once and for all. But what I found when I returned to the house where I had made the purchase was even more frightening than everything I had experienced up to that point. Determined to get rid of the car and get some answers, I returned to the house where I had met Anne. As I drove there, a weight seemed to accumulate in my chest, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The memories of the strange events that had occurred since I bought the car, and the disturbing information I had uncovered about the accident, were fresh in my mind. When I finally turned onto the street of the house, my heart raced. What I found left me in a state of shock. The house was completely abandoned, with broken windows and an overgrown, unkempt garden. It was as if no one had lived there for years. The state of the house was in stark contrast to the well-kept appearance it had when I made the purchase. I tried to rationalize, thinking that perhaps I was on the wrong street, but the location was the same. My panic increased when I realized that the number on the rusty mailbox was the same that Anne had given me. I got out of the car, hesitant, and approached the front door. It was ajar, creaking slightly with the wind. The interior of the house was in an even worse state of abandonment. The furniture was covered in dust, and the smell of mold permeated the air. I blinked several times, trying to understand what I was seeing. How could the house have changed so drastically in such a short time? Where was Anne? And why had I found all this? As I explored the house, I found some old letters scattered on the living room floor. I picked one up with a trembling hand and began to read. It was correspondence addressed to Anne, dated months before what seemed to be the accident. The letter mentioned financial problems and the difficult decision she would have to make regarding the car that had belonged to her husband. The most disturbing part, however, came at the end of the letter, where it was written, "I hope the sale of the car helps, but I also fear what may happen if the car doesn't find a new home quickly. It has never been at peace since that night." Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from one of the rooms in the back of the house. My muscles tightened, and the air seemed to freeze around me. I slowly walked towards the sound, each step amplifying the sense of impending danger. I opened the door to the room and was confronted with what seemed to be an improvised shrine. Photos of Anne and her husband were arranged on an altar, along with spent candles in a small urn. But what caught my attention were the newspaper clippings hanging on the wall, detailing the accident in which they both died. As I looked closer, my eyes stopped on a date, the date of the accident. It was exactly 1 year before the day I bought the car. My mind was spinning with questions. Anne and her husband died in that accident, but how then had I spoken to her? How had she managed to sell the car to me? I began to understand that the Anne I had met was not a living person. Somehow, she was tied to that car, or to something related to it. Perhaps she was trying to rid herself of the burden that the car represented, passing it on to someone else. But now, with the house in ruins and no sign of Anne, I realized that the car was back at its source of torment, without me having truly escaped. With a growing sense of despair, I left the house as quickly as I could and returned to the car, which now seemed much more threatening. I knew I could no longer simply return it. I was somehow bound to it. I tried to start the engine, but nothing happened. The keys seemed to have no effect. And then, in that moment of absolute terror, the radio turned on by itself, playing the same melancholic song as always. But this time, the voices seemed to whisper my name. Panic took hold of me, and only then did I realize that I was trapped in a curse I couldn't break. Anne's house was crumbling, but the spirit that haunted it was now with me, inside that car. I tried to get out, but the doors were locked. The sound of the radio grew louder, and my world began to spin. Everything went dark, and the last thing I remember is an intense cold and the feeling that the car was being taken somewhere unknown. I woke up the next morning, not in the car, but lying on the road where it always stalled. There was no sign of the vehicle. I was alone, with no clear memory of how I got there. Around me, everything was silent, except for a faint smell of burning in the air. Since that day, the car has never been seen again, and I carry the feeling that Anne is still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting owner.